how many of you are familiar with the BBC and also PBS show Call the Midwife? So this is a show that's about a group of Anglican nuns and nurse midwives who worked out of the Nonatus House in the East End of London in the 1950s. Now, the show, Call the Midwife, is actually based on a true story. It's based on the real stories of nurse Jennifer Worth. And along with her midwife colleagues, she helped some of the poorest women in London safely deliver their babies. These were women who couldn't afford doctors or private care. These women were often immigrants. Some of these women were facing really harsh and cruel conditions. And so these midwives that attended them, they were truly modern-day saints. Now, I love that this show demonstrates that midwives are truly a unique breed of woman. They are just built differently. Because midwives, they have to be calm in the midst of stressful situations. They have to prioritize their patients' care and comfort. And they offer support, encouragement, and guidance to really scared women on one of the hardest days of their lives. It's been said that midwifery is the oldest profession in the world because for as long as women have been giving babies, there have been other women there to attend them and help them. And a midwife's sole job is to bring new life into the world. So imagine how distressing and disturbing it would be if you were a midwife and you were told by someone in a position of power or authority over you that instead of ushering in this new life, you were to snuff it out. You were to kill every baby boy born into your care. This is the perversion of the job and the role of a midwife, because their role is to bring forth life, not to destroy it. Yet in Exodus chapter 1, that is the exact position that two midwives named Shiphrah and Puah found themselves in. Well, today we begin this new series called Faces of Our Faith, Bold and Untold Stories. Most of us, if we've grown up in the church, we can name some of the more well-known biblical heroes. We know all about Abraham and Moses and David, even Esther, Mary, the Apostle Paul. We know a bit about their stories and their backgrounds. But what about the stories of those in the Bible who are only mentioned just once or twice? What about the stories of those whose names we don't even know? What are their bold and untold stories? And how can their lives point us to God? And as we look deeper into these lesser-known biblical heroes, people like Shiphrah and Puah, we're also going to hear the stories of modern-day saints, those in our own lives and in our history who have put their fear of God and their faith in Christ before anything else. People like Harriet Tubman, people like those midwives and nuns in 1950s London. Now, before we can dive into Shiphrah and Puah's story, we need to understand a little bit of background information first. Because, how did the Israelites end up in Egypt anyway? Well, the story of Exodus, it actually begins several generations earlier and a book earlier in the book of Genesis. There, as you read in Genesis, you learn the stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Jacob had 12 sons, and one of those sons was named Joseph. And through a whole series of circumstances, Joseph winds up in Egypt and is raised to a position of power and prominence and authority. He becomes sort of an advisor to the Egyptian king or the Pharaoh. Now, when famine struck Canaan, which was the land that we know of as Israel, Joseph persuaded Jacob and his brothers to come and live with him in Egypt because there was plenty of food, there was plenty of resources, and so that's what happened. However, generations passed, and the descendants of Jacob, who were now known as Israelites, they continued to grow and multiply while they lived in Egypt. And then that brings us to Exodus 1, verse 8, where we're told that a new king, a new Pharaoh, comes into power who didn't know Joseph. And this Pharaoh, he saw the Israelite people as a threat. So he put several plans in place to deal with them, first by enslaving them, forcing them to work, and then by killing the baby boys. Now, after chapter 1, the book of Exodus continues with this epic story of how God rescued the Israelites, how God brought them out of slavery in Egypt, how God delivered them to the promised land. But before we can get to any of that, before we can get to Moses, before we can get to the 10 plagues and the 10 commandments, before we can get to the parting of the Red Sea, we have this story of two midwives named Shiphrah and Puah. Now, one other thing we need to know about Exodus is that it is the core salvation story for the Jewish or Israelite people. It is the story that defines them. It is the story of their salvation and deliverance. Now, as Christians, we have a different salvation story. Our salvation story is the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. And this story is so important to our faith that in the New Testament, we tell it 4 times: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And then the rest of the New Testament is how we are working out the implications of our salvation in Jesus. But for Jews, both for modern day Jews and ancient Israelites, Exodus is their salvation story. And this story defines who God is to them. God is the God who brought them out of slavery in Egypt, who delivered them. God is the God who rescued them. And so all throughout the rest of the Old Testament, it keeps pointing back to this story in Exodus. And so you'll read time and time again throughout the Old Testament that the Israelites were to do something because God delivered you out of Egypt. But none of this could have happened. The Exodus, the salvation, the deliverance from slavery, none of it could have taken place without the bravery of these two midwives. So their courage led to Moses being born safely. Moses would be the one to lead the people out of Egypt. And so through their mighty but simple actions, Shiphrah and Puah, they changed the course of history so that years later, another baby boy might be born. Another baby that was also born into a dark world of oppression and genocide, but would just grow up and survive to redeem all of humanity. Of course, I'm talking about Jesus. So their bravery, their actions led to Jesus' birth many, many generations later. Without these two women, not only would the Jewish or Israelite people not have their salvation story, we wouldn't have our salvation story either. I find it really interesting that Exodus is a book all about God's deliverance. But it begins with the story of Shiphrah and Puah, who were literally deliverers. They delivered the baby boys safely. Now, unfortunately, we don't know a whole lot else about Shiphrah and Puah. This is the only time that they're mentioned in the entire Bible. However, just the fact that we know their names, that they are named, tells us that their story is really important because oftentimes in biblical accounts, women went unnamed. So it's as if the biblical authors were shining a light on the page saying, these women are important. Pay attention to them. Now, just culturally speaking, we know that these midwives were likely low-status women. They probably had no families of their own. They may have even become midwives because they were barren and unable to bear children, so they were more available to help other women attend to their births. They were essentially glorified servants. They were pretty powerless in their society. And one other interesting thing I learned about these two women this week is that we don't technically know their ethnicity. The text only says that they were Hebrew midwives, but this could either mean that they were Egyptian women who were tasked to help the Hebrews, and that's why they kind of had this relationship with Pharaoh already, or it could mean that they were Hebrew themselves as they attended the Hebrew women. But their names, Shiphrah and Puah, they're kind of generic. We don't know what the language origin is for them, whether it's of Egyptian or Hebrew origin. But whatever their background, one thing we are told about them is that they feared and respected God. Now, a lot of times when we hear fear God, we think, oh, like be afraid of God. But that's not at all what it means. They were not afraid of God. They were not scared of what God might do to them. Rather, they honored God. And they respected God more than any earthly human leader. Their trust in God's power and God's protection, it was greater than their fear of Pharaoh and what Pharaoh might do to them. Now, were Shiphrah and Puah afraid? Were they worried about what Pharaoh might do to them if he found out about their trickery? Probably. I mean, they were human. They were probably very scared, but they chose to follow God even in the midst of their fear. So these two women, they were powerless. They had no status, and they risked everything to say no to this evil and oppressive king. They said no to brutally murdering these innocent baby boys. Now, Shiphrah and Puah's resistance to Pharaoh, it's the first known instance of civil disobedience, not only in the Bible, but in all of recorded history. Because they went against Pharaoh's direct orders to kill all the baby boys. And then, to cover up their actions, they lied straight to Pharaoh's face, and they used this excuse that the Hebrew women would give birth before they could come and attend to them. And in doing so, they were kind of playing upon Pharaoh's own prejudice and own racism towards the Hebrew people. Because Pharaoh, he saw the Hebrews as little more than animals. They were expendable, they were brutish. So when the Hebrew midwives would say, these Egyptian women, they give birth before we can get to them. They're not like the Egyptian women. They give birth before we can get there. They're kind of like playing into his own racism. It's kind of like a wink and a nudge, like saying, these women, they're just basically animals. They're just giving birth all on their own. And of course, I don't think they really believed that, but they kind of played it this way so they could show Pharaoh that they were on his side. Now, civil disobedience, it is a tricky subject in the world and especially in the church today because it raises a lot of hard questions. Questions like, when is it okay for us to lie if it's for a good cause? When is it right to disobey the leaders and the rulers who are in place over us? Is it ever okay to break a law? What if those laws are unfair or unjust? Civil disobedience, it might also bring to mind the leaders of the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s. People like Rosa Parks, who refused to give up her seat on the bus to a white person, even though that was what the law told her to do. People like the brave Black men and women who would go and have sit-ins and protests at all white establishments. People like Martin Luther King Jr. and other leaders who organized marches and gave speeches and tried to fight against the unjust Jim Crow laws that were in place over them in the South. Now today, we often hail these civil rights leaders as heroes. They are saints. But at the time, they were ridiculed and they were chastised for their actions and for their civil disobedience. And in fact, a group of white Christian pastors in Alabama, they told MLK that he needed to be quiet. He needed to stand down, to stop breaking laws, and to simply wait for change to come. Well, their words prompted MLK to write his now famous letter from a Birmingham jail, where he defended his actions of civil disobedience. And in that letter, he wrote these words: "We know through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed." And he goes on in this letter to lament that he was most disappointed not by the KKK, not by the people who were actively opposing him. He was most disappointed by these white moderate pastors because they were more devoted to order than to justice. I think in the church, we all want to think of ourselves as the heroes, as the Shiphrahs and Puahs, the Rosa Parks and the MLKs, the ones who stand up in the face of injustice, the ones who courageously use civil disobedience to fight for the right and for the good. But in reality, we are most often like those white moderate pastors, unwilling to rock the boat, content with the status quo, just going along with what's happening? When have we allowed our fear of men to be greater than our fear for God? When have we put our trust in human laws and rulers rather than in Christ? And when have we been more devoted to order than to justice? Now, overall, this story in Exodus 1, it's a story of oppression, of what happens when fear grows into hatred and eventually control. Because Pharaoh, he started using fear-mongering to kind of justify his abuse and mistreatment of the Israelite people. Kind of watch what happens as you were reading through Exodus chapter 1. First, Pharaoh, he sort of dehumanizes the Israelites. He says, I don't know these people. How did they get to Egypt anyway? They're not Egyptians. Why are they here? And so he began to cause the Egyptians to view the Israelites with distrust and suspicion. But very quickly, Pharaoh then stirred up fear and dread about the Israelites. And he said, well, they are growing in number. If war breaks out, they are going to turn against us. They're going to fight with our enemies. Did he have any proof that was going to happen? Probably not, but that was the lie he used to justify his hatred. And so this fear and this dread, it led to oppression. So as we read in Exodus, they pressed the Israelites into hard labor. They put taskmasters and foremen over them. They forced them to do all kinds of cruel work. And then ultimately, this slavery and oppression, it led to genocide. It led to the killing of all the baby boys. Hatred and disgust and suspicion, it led to fear and dread, which led to oppression and enslavement and ultimately to genocide. And when you break it down like that and you kind of see that progression, it's really easy to see how oppression could happen in any society, whether it's in Nazi Germany against Jewish people, whether it's against Black folks through slavery, through Jim Crow, or against immigrants through mass deportations, family separation, detention centers. But in every case of oppression, there are brave and courageous people who stand up against injustice and evil. They are the Shipras and the Puas, the Dietrich Bonhoeffers and the Corrie ten Booms, the Rosa Parks and the Martin Luther King Jr.'s. They are the faces of our faith, and their bold stories encourage us to resist evil, injustice, and oppression in whatever forms they present themselves. Now, sometimes their stories end on a positive note. For Shipra and Pua, their bravery and boldness, it was ultimately rewarded. When God saw their faithfulness, God treated the midwives well. God gave them households and families of their own. God elevated them from their lowly station. God blessed them. But their stories don't always turn out so positively. Sometimes for our heroes and these modern day saints, their stories end in tragedy. Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Corrie ten Boom were two people that resisted Hitler's evil and injustice in Nazi Germany. When ten Boom, they were both sent to concentration camps, and Corrie ten Boom, she was ultimately released, but her father and her sister died while they were imprisoned. And Dietrich Bonhoeffer, he was killed just days before Allied forces came to liberate the concentration camp where he was being held. So are we willing to do the brave and the bold thing, even if it's at great personal risk to ourselves? Are we willing to say no to evil, injustice, and oppression, even if we don't know if we'll get rewarded for our efforts? Well, I want to close by telling the story of one more face of our faith, someone who I consider to be a modern day saint, and that is Ms. Rachel. How many of you are familiar with Ms. Rachel? Yeah, if you have a toddler or a little one at home, you definitely know who Ms. Rachel is. Especially during COVID, she got a lot of parents through COVID because she has this YouTube channel that is full of educational videos and songs to help toddlers learn and grow. She is a really smart lady. She's an educator. She holds 2 master's degrees, one in early childhood development and one in music education. And so she uses these research-based videos to help toddlers and their families learn and grow and bond. But the thing about Miss Rachel is she is also a devout Christian. And she uses her platform to be very outspoken about her faith and her beliefs. And her Christian beliefs, they lead her to stand up, especially for vulnerable and underprivileged children. So in May 2025, she started a campaign where she called upon world leaders to help children who were suffering from malnutrition around the world. And she wrote, "I am a Christian, and Jesus tells us to feed the poor and to love our neighbor, and that everyone is our neighbor. That when we do things to help people in need, we do things for Jesus." Jesus did not say to help only your neighbors with the same skin color, same religion, or who were born in the same place. He just said, love your neighbor as yourself. Then a little bit after that, she was compelled to speak out on behalf of children who were suffering in Gaza from the war there. She posted on Instagram, "It is my unwavering belief that children aren't less valuable or less equal because of where they were born, the color of their skin, or the religion they practice. They are all precious and innocent children of God." Now, more recently, Ms. Rachel has been using her platform to advocate for immigrant children and to speak out against the practice of separating families in detention centers. So in June, just this past month, she visited Capitol Hill, and she brought with her a suitcase of handwritten letters and drawings from children who have been or remain in ICE custody. And there she shared these gut-wrenching stories of children who were taken from their parents, who were forced to live in terrible and unsanitary conditions, often without proper food or medical care. And she spoke with lawmakers, and she pressed them to intervene, and she shared her concerns with them. And so in this Washington Post article about her, she was quoted as saying, "I'll never stop trying for them. I can't say I'm just one person, so I'm not going to make a difference, because what if everyone said that?" So I think that Miss Rachel is a modern-day saint. She is a face of our faith. Like Shiphrah and Puah, she fought for the most vulnerable, the innocent, the children. And may we be as bold and as brave as she is. As we close, I want to invite you to make your own profession of faith, your own commitment to resist evil, injustice, and oppression using the words of the Iona Creed. Iona is a monastic community in Scotland, and they came up with this affirmation of faith. The words will be on the screen, and I invite you to join me in saying it now. We believe that God is present in the darkness before dawn, in the waiting and uncertainty where fear and courage join hands, conflict and caring link arms, and the sun rises over barbed wire. We believe in a with us God who sits down in our midst to share our humanity. We affirm a faith that takes us beyond a safe place into action, into vulnerability, and onto the streets. We commit ourselves to work for change and put ourselves on the line, to bear responsibility, to take risks, live powerfully, and face humiliation, to stand with those on the edge, to choose life, and be used by the Spirit for God's new community of hope. May that be our prayer today. Amen.